I uploaded a version of this video about a year ago that's 9 minutes long on how to sew a cloth pad with flannel and PUL. I am re-uploading without editing it down because I just rediscovered this footage as I was trying to make space on my phone, and I realized most of this is recorded in real time, which I rarely do because I'm trying to make quick videos. So I'm like, wow, I should just like re-upload this and see if anybody likes it. So this might be for somebody who just wants a really chill video to have going in the background while you're trying to sew your first or third pad, because I think it's slow enough that you might be able to do these steps with me, and we'll see how it goes. Let me know if you like it and what questions you have. There are no stupid questions because I've been doing this so long, I don't even remember what it's like to not know how to do it. So I need the obvious questions and I'm gonna try to make some like basic sewing videos for those. We've got 3 layers of flannel. This is going to be the absorbent part on the inside. A layer of flannel with the sewing line drawn onto it. We're going to position our needle directly on top of that line and follow it, sewing right on top of it. Doesn't matter what your seam allowance is here. You're going to trim it off later. And then the last layer is this polyurethane laminate. It's waterproof. You'll be good to go. Okay, let's go assemble. I am going to pin these layers in the middle of this line, center it in there, and then sew them all together. So I'm gonna sew around this part like that, and then we'll be back to attach this. It's gonna be okay. If you're nervous, it's all right. Before I totally unfold this, I'm gonna cut a couple layers of the core so I don't have to like cut all the layers manually. Okay, this is a rotary cutter, and with a cutting board, that means you can just press and roll and cut. You don't need this. You could just use scissors. That works just fine too. But this is what I have at the moment, so I'm just gonna do that. So for this pattern, you're gonna cut exactly on this shape. You don't leave any space around for like seam allowance or anything. All right, we've got 2 layers here. I think I'm gonna do 4. Wow, that might be a bit thick. We're gonna do 3 layers of flannel. I did not cut this in the most optimal way, but oh well. All right, there are the core absorbent inside layers. We'll set those aside for now. I'm gonna try to find a section that's not wrinkly. All right, does it look like there's a front and a back? That's probably fine. Okay, this is the shape of the sewing line. So I am going to use my marker. Oops. And I'm gonna draw this shape onto the fabric. I like to use a Sharpie, a really fine tip one. But you could also use whatever works best for you. Some people use like washable Crayola markers. Okay, that's the exact shape of the pad. That's what we're gonna sew on. Next, I'm going to roughly just cut around it. This is why you don't need to worry about having a seam allowance line with this pattern. You just cut out the shape quickly, does not matter. You could leave a bunch of excess on there if you wanted to. There we go. And you will trim off the excess later, after you sew the layers together. Next, we're gonna just roughly cut out a layer of PUL. So just toss this on here and cut out one layer of this. Doesn't have to be exact. Don't waste your energy trying to make exact seam allowance. Unnecessary. Okay, here's my topper layer. This is gonna go next to your skin. This is the inside absorbency part, and it's all pinned together. Use as many pins as you need to feel like it's not gonna shift around while you're sewing. There's no shame in using a lot of pins if you have them. So I'm just gonna sew a straight line inside of the core, just to attach it to the top. Okay, so my strategy here is I'm gonna try to align the edge of the core with the edge of the foot here and just use that as my guide. I'm gonna use a straight stitch.
a little longer, maybe like 3 or 3.5. Let's see here. 3 is probably good. If it's too short, I don't think the stitching looks very nice on the top, and it can also just, I don't think it's necessary. But anyway, here we go. Here we go. You can backstitch here to lock in the stitches. If you don't like the way having a knot on the top looks, then make your tails really long and pull them out so that you can just start stitching without backstitching. And then later, when you're all done, you can pull the threads through to the back and make a knot so that you don't see any backstitching. Whatever you want to do. Okay, here we go. I feel like it sounds like something is, oh, I think it pulled like my threads and probably made a bird's nest on the back of there. Oh well. Some people do a wavy stitch here, which I think looks really pretty. And it's functional as well to like add more stitching to hold the edge of the cord down. So some people are good at just like going at a steady speed and then manipulating this and turning it. I'm not really good at that, so when I go around curves like this, I usually do 3 stitches, then lift the presser foot and turn it slightly. It's gonna look the same. If anything, it might look better because everything stays flat and is not like pulled and manipulated. We're starting to get a little bit of like shifting here. It's not a big deal, but one way you could avoid that is by like basting these layers together with basting spray and then sewing the cord together and then attaching it to the top, but it's really not a big deal. Also, using more pins will help that. I guess leaving the pins in and just sewing over them, if you're comfortable with that, will take care of it. Okay, I tried the whole like doing the long tails thing, but I didn't do a good job of holding them out of the stitching, so they kind of got stitched over. So I'm just gonna cut these off and then backstitch at the end of this to lock them in. So it's not gonna look like the most beautiful, but it will be very functional. to backstitch, I'm gonna make my stitch length smaller, so like 2 to 2.5. And then go back a few times, go forward a few times, and then you're good to go. Oh no, did I run out of thread? Maybe I ran out. Ran out at the perfect time. Cool. Okay, here's the core sewn to the top layer. This is the side that's gonna face your body. So this is considered the right side. This is the side that's gonna face your underwear. So that's also considered the right side of this layer. This is the part that's inside, it will be hidden. So you're gonna place right sides together and pin them to sew them together. Try not to sew or to put pins inside this area because you're putting holes in the waterproof layer if you do that. So just like pin in the seam allowance area. Again, use as many pins as you want. I used to use so many pins when I was first starting out, and I still kind of do. I've watched other people sew pads and they use like 2 pins at the top and the bottom. I can't do that because I just get really fussy about it. It stresses me out when stuff starts to shift around, but yeah, you just do what you feel comfortable with. Okay, so we are going to leave a section here that is not sewn down. This is where we're gonna turn the pad right side out. And so I'm gonna choose the largest straight section available to me so that it's easier to turn this out. So that's gonna be right there for me. I'm gonna start sewing right here. I'm gonna backstitch to lock in the stitches, sew around on this line, and then end up over here, backstitch again to lock it in, and then I'll trim off the seam allowance, but I'll explain that in a minute. Okay, this is what sewing on the line looks like. It's what it's been referred to for several years now. Okay, so usually when you're sewing, you would use the edge of this as a guide against the side of your foot. So that's the seam allowance. But we're not doing that because this is a smaller item and you get more accurate shapes when you use a sewing line. So you position the needle on this line and sew on that and follow the whole shape of the pad. That's what my patterns are designed to do. Some of the earlier ones also include a seam allowance line, but once I got into more complicated shapes, it stopped being a good thing to include because it would really distort the shape of the pads. So here we go. Here we go.
I don't have audio for this part, so let me know if you would have preferred I put some like really quiet background music in this section, because it's like 5 minutes of stitching. But I was listening to some really like obnoxious music while I was sewing, so I couldn't like leave the sewing sounds in. But yeah, I always worry if I put in music and then somebody wants to watch the video sped up. I don't like that because then the music sounds distorted and it's really dissonant to listen to. But then if there's no sound whatsoever, then it sometimes feels grating on your nerves to be working in silence. So let me know what you would prefer if you like this style of like real-time sewing that's just chill and not over edited. If there's a long section that doesn't have sound, would you prefer that it just be silent or have some like lo-fi coffee shop music in the background? One thing that I like about this pattern, which is called the staple in my pattern collection, is that there are no sharp corners. And while that might be a little fussy at first, because I'm lifting the presser foot and turning the whole pad a few times around each corner, I prefer that over corners now. It just feels better when I'm sewing. I don't have a more logical way to put it. I just like it. And then when I'm trimming off the seam allowance, I can go around those curves with my pinking shears faster and more enjoyably than I can clip off corners or clip into them. So if you are using pinking shears to trim off seam allowance and it's like not working, the shears are just like getting caught in the fabric and it's not cutting it, go on, I found a pair on Amazon that are like $10 or $12 and they're really good. They cut through lots of thick layers and they do better than like the kind you can get in the store that are really expensive. I think I have them listed in my like links for supplies that I use. But yeah, it's really surprising. You would expect the more expensive brands to have better quality or at least be able to handle all those layers, but now we are going to trim off the seam allowance. I'm not sure why I decided to do it from this angle because it's kind of hard to see what's going on. I think I'm just bored. I'm like, what's a new way that I've never demonstrated trimming the seam allowance? So anyway, here are my pinking shears, and I'm gonna trim pretty close to the line that I've just sewn, and this helps the seam to lay really flat and not pucker once you turn the shape right side out. You could just use normal scissors and trim a little farther away from the sewing line, and that would work just fine. You would want to clip into the inner corners like a straight snip to release the tension that would be there if you didn't trim the seam allowance before you turn it right side out. So that's what I'm doing here. This is probably my least favorite step of the whole process, is trimming seam allowance. I left this little tab part so that when I turn the pad right side out, I can leave that flap there and sew it down with top stitching.
All right, here's the shape with the seam allowance trimmed off with the pinking shears. I'm just gonna go in with like these scissors here to check out these spots right here. If you don't have enough trimmed off, then it could pucker after you turn this right side out, but you don't want to trim too close to the sewing line because then you risk fraying at the seam if you're too close and it just like disintegrates. So it's a fine balance, and you'll discover what works best after you do it a few times. So yeah, don't cut too close to that line, but you do want to release the tension so that the seam will lay flat. I think that's one of the very common frustrations for somebody who's just sewing pads for the first time, is they turn it out and they notice that it won't lay flat. And that's usually the problem, that these like inner corners are puckering. Okay, I like to crinkle it a little bit so it'll just be softer, trying to travel through that hole. Okay, I've got it mostly turned right side out, so I'm going to use this knitting needle that's not too sharp, because if it's too sharp, sometimes it'll just like poke right through the seam. So anyway, I'm going to use this pointy object to push all the seams out. I consider this to be pretty important prep work if you want the seams to look really nice and even on your pad. Not a big deal. If you're just sewing for yourself and you really don't care what it looks like, then you don't have to go through all of this like fussiness. But if you want it to look really even, then this is a pro tip. It's a very common thing that people do. It's not like I came up with it though. So I like to push it all out and then put it down. You can iron it as well. That definitely helps the seams to be flat when you go to top stitch it. But I'm just gonna finger press it and call it good today, because I'm trying to do things in a way that is like most accessible to someone who's just starting. Like I don't even have my iron with me right now, so it's a lot to assume that everybody would have access to all of these tools right at the beginning of their sewing journey. So I'm just gonna like rub the seam here to make sure that it's even. Do that all around the outside. And then I'm gonna sew kind of close to the edge all the way around to finish the pad. And then that'll be it. I'll put snaps on and it'll be ready to use. Now this I think would look better if I used white thread, but again, it'll be very functional, so not a big deal. Pay attention to this, the turning spot, because the way that you sew it down right now is how it's gonna look forever. So get it laying nice and flat right now, and then press it with an iron or pin it down, clip it, something, because it likes to not cooperate sometimes. I hear somebody leaf blowing right now, and it's dark outside. I think I'm gonna use a different foot. I like to use this foot because I can move the needle to the right a little farther. And some people ask me what feet I'm using, and it doesn't really matter unless you have like my exact sewing machine. You just gotta find what you like with your sewing machine, because the Singer that I had before this one's a Bernina, but each sewing machine I've had, like I preferred using different feet. You just have to like experiment and see what works well for your machine. So don't feel like you have to go fast. You can stop and make sure the edge is even. That's what I do. I get a little fussy about it. Okay, there's the pad. If you made it this far, I want you to give yourself some kind of praise. You did a good job. You've made it pretty far. The last thing to do is add some kind of closure here. People usually use cam snaps, which are plastic snaps you press on. And that's what I'll use for this.
Here's the big snap press I got for when I was making a ton of pads. The hand press also works just fine. I always use bronze snaps because I found that the metallic bronze kind of matches everything. And it particularly matches the brown fleece that I have. But yeah, you can play with using different colors or just getting one color for all of them. So I like to fold the wings around into the position that looks good for me. And then I will poke the pokey tool, owl, is that how you say that? Through one wing, and then be careful to not poke through the back of the pad. But yeah, just make like a little mark so then you can flip it over and make the actual hole. And then set the different snaps. With the pressing tool, there's two different die parts for this. So for the innie and the outie parts, you gotta switch out the press tool. So that it won't like smush the parts. Anyway, maybe we need a video on that, on using the cam press machine, the handheld one and the big one. But if you have questions, please let me know. I hope that this has been helpful, enjoyable, new style of video for me, even though this is an old video. I don't normally post long videos like this, so we'll see how it goes.